Hello everyone, welcome to History and Culture. Friends who often watch Chinese historical costume dramas may be familiar with the term wet nurse. In ancient China, the role of a wet nurse was a very common profession. From the royal family and nobility to wealthy households, many of which had wet nurses. The main responsibility of a wet nurse, as the name suggests, was to feed the children in the household, especially infants. Generally, a wet nurse's duties involved feeding the child and taking care of their daily needs. However, for some wet nurses, their duties went far beyond this. They would accompany the child as they grew, assuming a more comprehensive caregiving role, and could even stay with the child until they grew up. In this case, the role of a wet nurse is somewhat similar to that of a modern-day nanny. It is worth noting that the term wet nurse was not fixed. In addition to Nanyang, people also referred to them as Runyang, Mama, or Amu, all of which referred to women responsible for breastfeeding and taking care of children. However, in ancient times, especially within the royal family, the responsibilities of a wet nurse were particularly strict, even to the point of being harsh. For instance, a wet nurse for the imperial princes not only had to fulfill the normal feeding tasks but also had to adhere to some extremely strict regulations. One of these rules might even seem inhumane. Moreover, if an accident occurred to the prince or princess under a wet nurse's care, the wet nurse could be held responsible and face severe punishment. This system reflects the royal family's emphasis on childcare and also highlights the heavy pressure behind the profession of a wet nurse. According to related historians, the origins of the wet nurse profession can be traced back more than 3,000 years, with the earliest record appearing in the Zhou Li, Book of Rites, in the phrase, Shifu Ji Ziyo Shirmu. The term, Shirmu, refers to what we now call a wet nurse. The appearance of this phrase marks the birth of the wet nurse profession in ancient China. And it also reflects the strict hierarchical system of feudal society. Some people could be at the top of the social ladder, not needing to personally breastfeed their children, leaving that task to a wet nurse. Meanwhile, others had to live humbly, even giving up the right to raise their own children in order to care for someone else's. This social system was very harsh, exposing the huge wealth gap and the helplessness and hardship of the lower classes. In feudal society, most wet nurses came from humble backgrounds. They were mostly from poor families and often continued to live in poverty even after marriage. In ancient times, there was no social security like there is today, and the lack of modern welfare systems made life exceptionally difficult. If a family had no money or land to trade for food, survival could become extremely challenging, even facing the risk of starvation. Therefore, many young people, especially young women from poor families, chose to enter the palace to serve the royal family or become servants in wealthy households. Becoming a wet nurse also became a survival choice for many young women who had just become mothers. Some curious friends may ask why the empresses and concubines of ancient emperors did not personally breastfeed their children but instead hired wet nurses. Although it should be a natural instinct for mothers to breastfeed their children, the royal concubines in ancient China generally chose wet nurses to do this. And there were profound reasons behind this. First, every imperial prince had the potential to become the future emperor, or even the highest leader of the country. Therefore, from the moment a prince was born, he needed to receive the best care, particularly in terms of diet, to ensure his physical health and enable him to carry the heavy responsibility of ruling the empire in the future. This is the fundamental reason why most concubines did not breastfeed their children personally, but instead hired wet nurses. In ancient times, the essentials of clothing, shelter, and transportation in the imperial palace were easily taken care of. The palace had countless luxurious palaces, and anyone could be chosen to house the princes, with the palace maids making sure everything was well maintained. The emperor's clothing was also exquisite and luxurious. And the high-quality fabrics offered to the palace every year piled up like a mountain, making the production of clothes effortless. As for travel, sedan chairs and carriages were readily available. However, the most challenging matter to handle was food. Especially for newborn babies who were entirely dependent on breastfeeding. Many concubines would become physically weak after childbirth, particularly those in the palace. With their privileged lifestyle and being pampered, their physical constitution was often relatively poor. Given these physical conditions, the quality and quantity of breast milk could not always be guaranteed, and some concubines might even be unable to breastfeed at all. Therefore, it became essential to select strong, healthy wet nurses to feed the children, which not only ensured the health and growth of the princes but also provided the emperor with psychological comfort, as it was believed that healthy wet nurses could provide better milk. Secondly, caring for a child was not as simple as just breastfeeding. Newborn babies were highly dependent on the adults caring for them, especially their mothers. If a concubine personally breastfed her child, the prince would start to recognize his mother's scent, voice, and embrace. When another person took over the baby's care, the infant would notice the difference in scent and touch, leading to restlessness, crying, and even possible refusal to nurse. Continuous crying would hinder the child's growth, and for newborns, such anxiety and discomfort could be particularly detrimental. To prevent this, and ensure that the princes received stable care without discomfort from changing caregivers, the palace would usually entrust the wet nurse with full responsibility for the prince's care. The wet nurse not only handled feeding but also took on all the daily care duties, ensuring that the child could grow up in a stable environment. Thirdly, the concubines who gave birth to princes were mostly from prestigious noble families. In ancient times, the idea of marriage within one's social status prevailed. The women who became wives of the emperor were generally daughters of high-ranking officials or nobles. Though in modern historical dramas, it's common to see common women having fateful encounters with the emperor and embarking on passionate love stories. In reality, this scenario was nearly impossible. Even the emperor himself couldn't always choose his spouse at will. Their marriages were subject to many restrictions. Thus, the women who became concubines were usually from noble backgrounds. These noble-born concubines, who had been taken care of since childhood and lived privileged lives, often had little opportunity to learn how to care for babies. They typically lacked experience and patience in raising children. If the princes were entrusted to their care, the question of whether the princes could grow up healthily would become a significant concern. Because of this, the role of the wet nurse was especially important in ancient court life. Fourth, the presence of wet nurses also helps cultivate the independence of the royal princes and trains their ability to be self-reliant. In ancient times, most concubine status was tied to their children, with their offspring symbolizing their power, especially for those of noble birth. The love that mothers felt for their children was often deep and overwhelming. And excessive pampering could lead to a loss of the child's ability to make independent judgments. For the royal princes, excessive dependence on their mother's care could lead to a lack of independence. They might lose their ability to make decisions on their own and follow their mother's instructions for everything. As these princes grew older, they could become weak, indecisive, and perhaps even incapable of shouldering the heavy responsibility of governing the country. Even more seriously, if a prince is too dependent on his mother, this could lead to a situation where the Empress Dowager governs. In this case, the prince would not only lack independent judgment, but he could also be manipulated by his mother and her family, resulting in political instability. Fifth, the needs and habits of infants are not fixed, as they have not yet developed self-awareness. When they are hungry, they cry, when they want to eat, and when they don't want to, they won't touch food. This leads to irregular feeding times, posing a significant challenge for those caring for the child. As the emperor's wives, concubines held high status. But how could they find time to breastfeed at any given moment? Especially in ancient times. Under the strict moral codes of 3 obediences and 4 virtues, women were not permitted to expose their bodies freely, making it even more difficult for the concubines to personally nurse their children. Therefore, considering these factors, it was reasonable and necessary for the mothers of royal princes not to personally breastfeed their children in ancient times. It is worth noting that the selection of wet nurses for royal princes had very strict requirements. Because of the royal prince's noble status, it was essential that they drank safe milk. From a modern medical perspective, diseases like hepatitis B and HIV can be transmitted through breast milk. Although ancient people did not have advanced medical knowledge, they had long recognized the connection between breast milk and certain diseases. As a result, the primary criterion for selecting wet nurses was ensuring their physical health. In the selection process, wet nurses were not only required to be healthy but also had their skin condition closely scrutinized, such as whether they had scars. These seemingly minor details were actually crucial, as any health risks could affect the prince's growth. Therefore, the selection standards were very strict, with the goal of choosing the most suitable and healthiest wet nurse. Secondly, there were certain age requirements for wet nurses. In ancient times, early marriage and early childbirth were promoted. Women around the age of 16 to 20, who had just given birth for about 3 months, were most likely to be selected by the royal family. This was because the ancients believed that women in this age range had the most abundant and best quality breast milk, capable of providing sufficient nutrition to help the royal children grow up healthily. Therefore, women in this age group were typically the most favored candidates for wet nurses by the royal family. Thirdly, the selection of wet nurses also considered their appearance. Since wet nurses were responsible for taking care of the royal children, and this process was usually long-term, the wet nurse would accompany the royal child throughout his growth. As the child gradually grew older, there would be many occasions and events where the wet nurse had to be present by his side. If the wet nurse's appearance was too ordinary or unattractive, it would undoubtedly affect the public perception of the royal family, especially when attending formal events where the royal image was of utmost importance. Therefore, in order to maintain the royal family's reputation, appearance was also an important factor in the selection of a wet nurse. Typically, women who were more elegant and good-looking were prioritized. Fourthly, the family background of the wet nurse was also very important. Women from families with a bad reputation usually could not pass the selection process. Since wet nurses were required to take care of the royal children for an extended period, families with a history of theft, criminal behavior, or other immoral actions might have a negative influence on the royal child's development. In ancient Chinese society, moral principles such as benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and trust were highly valued, and the royal family usually maintained a zero-tolerance attitude toward individuals with questionable family backgrounds. As a result, the family background of the wet nurse would be strictly examined to ensure there were no undesirable records, in order to avoid any negative impact on the royal child. The most important, and also the most inhumane, rule was that a woman who became the royal child's wet nurse, even if she had children of her own at home, was not allowed to bring her own children into the palace. Once she entered the palace, she was not allowed to leave and had to stay by the royal child's side to care for him. This rule clearly violated natural laws. Motherly love for a child is a universal phenomenon in nature. Whether for humans or animals, mothers typically regard their own children as the center of their lives. For many mothers, their children become the most important existence in their lives the moment they are born. However, these wet nurses, driven by necessity, left their own children to enter the palace and care for the royal child, losing the opportunity to personally raise their own offspring. although this rule may seem cold and heartless. From the ruler's perspective, there were certain reasons behind it. Because, for every mother, her child is the most important, and this is no exception for wet nurses. Even if they are taking care of a prince. If they are also allowed to care for their own children, wet nurses are likely to show more love and favoritism toward their own children. This situation is clearly not conducive to the prince's growth, especially in the context of the prince's noble status. In order to ensure that the prince receives the best care, the ruler decided to require the wet nurses to stay away from their own children and focus all their attention on caring for the prince. Additionally, if a wet nurse were to leave the palace, she might be abducted by other forces and could potentially become involved in a threat to or conspiracy against the prince. This potential danger led the ruler to decide that the wet nurses should stay close to the prince at all times to ensure his safety and stability. Of course, because of this, many wet nurses poured all their love into the prince, treating him as their own child. During their time together, the prince gradually developed a deep emotional bond with the wet nurse. And many princes became very dependent on their wet nurses, even feeling deeply grateful for the care they received. Historical records show that Wang Lianshou, the wet nurse of the last emperor Fui, was born into a poor peasant family. Due to flooding, Wang Lianshou's family situation worsened. They lost their primary source of livelihood, and eventually, she had to seek refuge with her brother in the capital. Initially, Wang Lianshou was arranged to marry a low-ranking official, and life gradually improved. However, fate was cruel, and after she gave birth to a daughter, her husband passed away due to illness, throwing her back into hardship. In this difficult situation, Wang Lianshou was unexpectedly chosen to become Fui's wet nurse. She took great care of the young Fui, providing him with attentive love and care. Due to her affection, the young Fui became very dependent on her and often followed her advice. In fact, when Fui first saw the critically ill Empress Dowager Cixi, he was so frightened that he cried and immediately called out to find Wang Lianshou. Throughout Fui's growth, Wang Lianshou remained an important figure in his life. When Fui was impolite to the servants or even bullied the eunuchs, Wang Lianshou would step in and stop him, patiently educating him, "If you hurt these eunuchs, who will take care of you?" After hearing this, Fui felt it made sense, and he stopped being mischievous, beginning to treat others with more respect. Some historians have commented that while certain aspects of the wet nurse system may seem harsh, it was precisely this special relationship that fostered deep emotional bonds between many emperors and their wet nurses. This mother-child-like affection was extremely precious. As times changed and society developed, the profession of wet nurse gradually became incompatible with the needs of modern society and eventually disappeared into the annals of history. This is the History and Culture channel. Liking and subscribing are the greatest help and support to us. Thank you everyone and see you in the next time.